The smoky air of Murphy's boxing gym in Brooklyn hung thick with sweat and determination. On a humid July evening in 1923, electric bulbs cast harsh shadows across the worn wooden floors where fighters trained for their next bout. The sound of leather gloves hitting heavy bags echoed through the converted warehouse, mixing with the sharp commands of trainers and the rhythmic skipping of rope. Tommy the Hammer. Sullivan stood in the center ring, his muscled frame glistening under the lights. At 22, he had already made a name for himself in the local boxing circuit, with 12 wins and only 1 loss on his record. His reputation for devastating right hooks had earned him respect among the tough crowd that gathered at Murphy's each night. Outside the ring, a small group of spectators had gathered for the evening's sparring sessions. Factory workers still in their coveralls, dock workers with calloused hands, and neighborhood boys who dreamed of glory in the squared circle. They came to Murphy's not just to train, but to witness the raw display of skill and courage that defined their working-class community. Near the back of the crowd stood 17-year-old Marcus Webb, a thin boy with wire-rimmed spectacles and clothes that marked him as different from the usual gym patrons. His father owned a small bookstore on Atlantic Avenue, and Marcus spent most afternoons helping with inventory and reading literature that transported him far from the gritty streets of Brooklyn. Tonight, however, curiosity had drawn him to this temple of physical prowess. Tommy noticed the boy immediately. Everything about Marcus seemed out of place in the gym. His clean clothes, his careful posture, the way he held himself with the cautious air of someone more comfortable with books than boxing gloves. When Murphy called for volunteers to spar with Tommy, Marcus surprised everyone by raising his hand. The laughter started low and built like a wave through the crowd. Tommy's friends nudged each other, pointing at the skinny kid, who thought he could step into the ring with one of Brooklyn's rising boxing prospects. Even Murphy, the grizzled gym owner who had seen every type of fighter come through his doors, shook his head with amusement. "Kid, you sure about this?" Murphy asked, his Irish accent thick with concern. "Tommy here ain't exactly gentle with newcomers." Marcus adjusted his glasses and nodded firmly. "I understand the risks, sir. I would like to try." Tommy's grin widened as he looked down at the boy who barely reached his shoulder. This would be entertaining, if nothing else. The crowd pressed closer to the ring, sensing that they were about to witness either a comedy show or a complete disaster. As Marcus climbed through the ropes, his movements were careful and deliberate. He had never been in a boxing ring before, but he had spent countless hours reading about the sport, studying the techniques and strategies that separated champions from casualties. Books on boxing science, articles about legendary fighters, and detailed analyses of famous matches had filled his evenings for months. Murphy handed Marcus a pair of worn leather gloves, shaking his head as he helped tie them. "These might be too big for you, son, but they're the smallest we got." The bell rang, and Tommy immediately moved forward with the confidence of someone who expected a quick victory. His stance was textbook perfect, left foot forward, hands up, ready to end this mismatch before it truly began. The crowd fell silent, anticipating the moment when reality would crash down on the bookish boy's foolish ambition. But as Marcus raised his hands and settled into his stance, something unexpected happened. His positioning was unusual, almost scientific in its precision. His left foot was placed at an angle that seemed awkward to the untrained eye, but those with real boxing knowledge recognized elements of techniques that had been discussed in recent boxing journals from Europe. Tommy's confident smile faltered slightly as he studied his opponent's stance. It was different from anything he had encountered in his years of fighting in Brooklyn's gyms and small venues. Marcus held his gloves in a way that seemed to offer multiple defensive options while maintaining offensive, possibilities that Tommy could not immediately predict. The crowd's laughter died down as they, too, noticed that something was different about this seemingly helpless challenger. Marcus stood perfectly still, his breathing controlled and steady, his eyes focused with an intensity that surprised everyone present. Tommy decided to test the waters with a light jab, expecting to find Marcus completely unprepared for even the most basic attack. What happened next would change everything. Anyone in that gym thought they knew about boxing, courage, and the power of preparation over presumption. Tommy threw his exploratory jab with casual confidence, expecting to connect easily with the inexperienced boy's face. Instead, His glove met nothing but air as Marcus executed a subtle head movement that seemed almost effortless. The dodge was not wild or panicked like most beginners would attempt, but precise and economical, requiring minimal energy while completely avoiding the strike. The crowd murmured in surprise. Even experienced fighters in the gym stopped their own training to focus on what was happening in the center ring. Tommy's jab had been thrown with enough speed and accuracy to catch most amateur fighters, yet this bookish teenager had made it look simple to avoid. Tommy's expression shifted from amusement to curiosity. He threw another jab, this time with more commitment and speed. Again, Marcus moved just enough to let the punch pass harmlessly by his head. His footwork was unlike anything the Brooklyn fighters had seen before. Not the shuffling, flat-footed movement of local street fighters, but something more refined and scientific. "Where did you learn to move like that, kid?" Tommy asked, genuinely puzzled as they circled each other in the ring. Marcus did not respond immediately, his focus entirely on reading Tommy's body language and positioning. He had spent months studying the writings of boxing theorists who emphasized the importance of distance, timing, and angles over brute force. While other boys his age were playing stickball in the streets, Marcus had been analyzing the geometric principles that governed effective boxing defense. Tommy decided to increase the pressure, throwing a combination of punches designed to overwhelm his opponent. Left jab, right cross, left hook, a sequence that had dropped several of his previous opponents. But Marcus seemed to anticipate each punch before it was thrown, moving with an almost dance-like quality that kept him just outside the range of Tommy's strikes. The gymnasium fell completely silent except for the sound of gloves cutting through air and feet moving across the canvas. Even Murphy, who had been calling out instructions to other fighters, stopped to watch this unprecedented display. In 40 years of running boxing gyms, he had never seen a complete beginner demonstrate such sophisticated defensive skills. What the crowd could not see was the intense mental calculation happening behind Marcus's wire-rimmed glasses. Every movement Tommy made was being processed through the theoretical framework Marcus had absorbed from his extensive reading. He recognized the subtle weight shifts that preceded different types of punches, the eye movements that telegraphed targets, and the breathing patterns that indicated when his opponent was preparing to attack. Tommy's frustration began to mount as punch after punch failed to find its mark. His technique remained sound, but he was fighting an opponent who seemed to exist half a step ahead of every action he attempted. Sweat began to form on Tommy's forehead, not from physical exertion, but from the mental strain of trying to solve this unexpected puzzle. The other fighters in the gym had completely stopped their own training sessions to witness this strange dance between the established local fighter and the mysterious newcomer. Conversations ceased, and the only sounds were the scuffling of feet on canvas and the occasional whistle of air as punches missed their intended targets. Marcus had not thrown a single offensive punch, focusing entirely on defense and observation. He was learning Tommy's patterns, timing his reactions, and building a mental map of his opponent's capabilities and weaknesses. This was exactly what the boxing manuals had recommended. Study your opponent before committing to any aggressive actions. Tommy stepped back, breathing heavily despite the fact that none of his punches had landed. His confidence was shaken, but his pride demanded that he find a way to connect with this elusive target. He had built his reputation on being able to overwhelm opponents with superior skill and power. Yet here he stood, completely frustrated by a teenager who looked like he belonged in a library rather than a boxing ring. "You gonna fight back, or just dance around all night?" Tommy called out, trying to provoke Marcus into abandoning his defensive strategy. Marcus adjusted his glasses, which had somehow remained perfectly positioned throughout the entire exchange, and finally spoke. "I am studying your technique, Mr. Sullivan. It is quite impressive, but I believe I have identified some patterns that might be improved." The crowd erupted in surprised laughter at the polite, almost academic tone Marcus used to address the increasingly flustered boxer. Tommy's face reddened, not just from exertion, but from embarrassment at being analyzed like a specimen under a microscope. Murphy called for a brief break, ostensibly to let both fighters catch their breath, but really because he needed time to process what he was witnessing. In his decades of experience, he had learned to recognize natural talent when he saw it. But Marcus represented something entirely different, the application of pure intellect to the brutal art of boxing. As the two fighters returned to their corners, The atmosphere in the gym had completely changed. What had started as entertainment at the expense of an overconfident boy had become something much more intriguing and unpredictable. The brief rest period allowed Tommy to reassess his approach while Marcus quietly observed the growing crowd around the ring. Word had spread through the neighborhood that something unusual was happening at Murphy's gym, and men were filtering in from the street, drawn by the buzz of excitement and disbelief. Murphy approached Marcus's corner, his weathered face showing a mixture of concern and fascination. "Son, I got to ask, you ever been in a ring before tonight?" Marcus shook his head while carefully adjusting his gloves. "No, sir, this is my first time, but I have spent considerable time studying the scientific principles of boxing. I believe there are mathematical relationships that govern effective technique." The old trainer's eyebrows shot up at this unexpected response. In his 4 decades around fighters, he had heard every possible explanation for boxing ability: natural talent, street fighting experience, military training, even claims of divine intervention, but never had anyone mentioned mathematics as preparation for stepping into the ring. Tommy paced in his corner, his earlier confidence replaced by a growing sense of urgency. His reputation was on the line in front of an audience that was rapidly expanding. Factory workers from the evening shift had begun crowding into the gym, and he could hear excited conversations in multiple languages as word spread through Brooklyn's immigrant communities. When the fighters returned to the center of the ring, Tommy's approach had changed dramatically. Gone was the casual, almost playful attitude he had displayed at the beginning. His stance was lower, more aggressive, and his eyes held the focused intensity of a man who understood that his credibility was being challenged. Marcus noticed the change immediately. His extensive reading had taught him that the most dangerous moment in any boxing match came when a skilled opponent abandoned restraint and committed fully to offensive action. The scientific approach he had been employing would now face its most severe test. Tommy launched a brutal combination, putting his full weight and speed behind each punch. This was no longer a sparring session or a casual demonstration. This was serious boxing, with the intention of ending the fight decisively. His right cross carried enough power to drop most opponents, and it was aimed directly at Marcus's jaw. But as the punch approached, Marcus executed a defensive maneuver that seemed to defy the expectations of everyone watching. Instead of simply moving his head to avoid the strike, he stepped forward and slightly to his left, allowing the punch to pass over his right shoulder while simultaneously closing the distance between himself and his opponent. The movement placed Marcus in an unexpected position, close enough to Tommy that the boxer's powerful swings became less effective, but perfectly positioned for Marcus to launch his first offensive action of the entire match. What happened next silenced the growing crowd completely. Marcus threw a short, precise uppercut that traveled no more than 8 inches, but connected perfectly with Tommy's solar plexus. The punch was not thrown with the wild power that characterized most amateur attempts, but with perfect timing and placement that maximized its impact, despite Marcus's modest physical strength. Tommy's eyes widened in shock as the air was driven from his lungs. The punch had been so unexpected and so precisely placed that his body's natural defensive reflexes had been completely bypassed. He staggered backward, gasping for breath, while Marcus calmly returned to his defensive stance. The silence in the gym was absolute. Men who had been shouting encouragement and commentary moments before now stood with their mouths open, trying to process what they had witnessed. The skinny kid with glasses had just landed a clean, effective punch on one of Brooklyn's most promising young boxers. Murphy felt his heart skip a beat as he recognized the significance of what had occurred. The uppercut had been thrown with textbook precision, demonstrating not just theoretical knowledge, but the ability to apply that knowledge under pressure. This was not luck or accident. This was skill of the highest order. Tommy recovered his breathing but found himself facing a completely different situation than he had anticipated. When he first stepped into the ring, the boy across from him was no longer a source of amusement or easy victory. Marcus had proven that he possessed not only defensive capabilities, but the ability to strike with devastating accuracy when the opportunity presented itself. The crowd began to murmur again, but the tone had shifted completely. Instead of laughter and casual entertainment, there was now genuine interest and growing respect for the unexpected challenger. Some of the older fighters present began to recognize that they were witnessing something rare, the emergence of a natural boxing talent that had been developed Through study rather than street experience, Marcus adjusted his glasses once more and returned to his patient analytical stance. He had learned valuable information from his first offensive action, confirming that his theoretical understanding could be translated into practical results. But he also understood that Tommy would now approach the remainder of their encounter with the full seriousness that the situation demanded. The real test of his unconventional preparation was about to begin, as Tommy's expression hardened into the focused determination of a fighter who had been genuinely challenged and was prepared to respond with everything he possessed. Tommy's face flushed with a mixture of embarrassment and determination as he realized that his opponent was far more dangerous than anyone in the gym had imagined. The casual atmosphere that had surrounded their initial exchange evaporated completely, replaced by the electric tension that accompanied serious boxing matches. The crowd pressed closer to the ring, sensing that they were witnessing something extraordinary. Men who had arrived expecting to see a quick demonstration of superior skill over amateur enthusiasm now found themselves watching a genuine contest between two very different approaches to the art of boxing. Tommy abandoned any remaining restraint and launched into the most aggressive assault of his young career. His combinations came in waves, left hooks followed by right crosses, uppercuts mixed with body shots, all thrown with the speed and power that had made him a rising star in Brooklyn's boxing scene. The intensity of his attack would have overwhelmed most experienced fighters, let alone a 17-year-old making his first appearance in a boxing ring. But Marcus had prepared for exactly this scenario during his months of theoretical study. The boxing manuals had warned that the most dangerous moments came when skilled opponents committed fully to offensive barrages. His response was not to panic or attempt to match Tommy's aggression, but to implement the defensive strategies he had memorized and practiced in his imagination. Marcus moved like water around stone, flowing away from each punch while maintaining perfect balance and positioning. His footwork created angles that made Tommy's powerful strikes ineffective, while his head movement seemed to anticipate each attack before it was fully developed. What appeared to be natural defensive ability was actually the result of countless hours studying the geometry of boxing and the physics of human movement. The crowd watched in growing amazement as punch after punch failed to connect with the elusive target. Tommy's combinations, which had been devastating against previous opponents, seemed to have no effect on the thin boy who moved with an almost supernatural ability to avoid damage. Murphy found himself gripping the ring ropes, his experienced eye recognizing defensive skills that rivaled those of professional fighters he had trained over the decades. The boy's technique was unorthodox but incredibly effective, combining elements from different boxing styles in ways that created new possibilities for defensive action. Tommy's frustration mounted with each missed punch. Sweat poured down his face as he poured more and more energy into attacks that seemed to pass through his opponent, like Marcus was made of smoke. His breathing became labored, and his technique began to deteriorate as fatigue and desperation took their toll. Marcus, meanwhile, remained calm and controlled. His breathing was steady, his movements economical, and his focus unshakable. While Tommy exhausted himself with wild combinations, Marcus continued to study and learn, building a complete understanding of his opponent's capabilities and limitations. The turning point came when Tommy, desperate to land a decisive blow, overextended himself with a powerful right cross that left him momentarily off balance. Marcus recognized the opportunity instantly, his theoretical knowledge translating into practical action with perfect timing. Instead of throwing a counterpunch, Marcus executed a subtle foot sweep that barely made contact with Tommy's ankle, but was perfectly timed to coincide. With the boxer's forward momentum, the result was devastating. Tommy stumbled forward, his balance completely compromised, and fell to one knee in the center of the ring. The crowd erupted in shocked exclamations and disbelief. The established local fighter was on the canvas, not from a knockout punch, but from a technique so subtle and precise that many spectators had not even seen it happen. Tommy's face burned with humiliation as he quickly regained his footing, but the psychological impact of the moment was irreversible. Marcus stepped back respectfully, offering his hand to help Tommy up, a gesture that somehow made the situation even more remarkable. Here was complete sportsmanship from someone who had just demonstrated superior boxing skills against a much more experienced opponent. Tommy accepted the offered assistance, his respect for his unexpected opponent growing with each passing moment. As they faced each other once more, Both fighters understood that something fundamental had changed in their encounter. The noise from the crowd had shifted from casual entertainment to genuine appreciation for the skill being displayed. Men who had come to watch a mismatch were now witnessing a boxing lesson being delivered by someone who should have been the student rather than the teacher. Murphy called for another brief break, but this time it was not to rest the fighters. It was to give himself time to process what he was seeing. In his long career, he had developed an eye for recognizing special talent, but Marcus represented something entirely new in his experience. As the fighters prepared for the final phase of their encounter, the entire atmosphere in the gym had been transformed. What had begun as entertainment had become education, and everyone present understood they were witnessing the emergence of something remarkable in the world of boxing. The final round began with a completely transformed dynamic between the two fighters. Tommy approached Marcus with genuine respect, his earlier arrogance replaced by the cautious appreciation of someone who had been thoroughly outclassed by an opponent he had initially dismissed. The crowd, now numbering nearly 50 spectators, watched in absolute silence as the conclusion of this unprecedented encounter unfolded. Marcus had proven every point he had set out to demonstrate. His months of theoretical study had been validated in the most practical way possible, through direct application against a skilled and motivated opponent. But rather than pressing his advantage or attempting to humiliate Tommy further, Marcus chose to end the sparring session with the same scientific approach he had maintained throughout. Instead of engaging in further combat, Marcus removed his gloves and extended his hand toward Tommy in a gesture of mutual respect. "Mr. Sullivan, you are an excellent boxer with tremendous natural ability. I have learned much from observing your technique, and I hope that perhaps my approach might offer some insights that could benefit your training." Tommy stared at the offered handshake for a moment, processing the complete reversal of roles that had occurred over the course of their encounter. Here was the person he had intended to embarrass, offering constructive feedback and genuine appreciation for his skills. The gesture was so unexpected and gracious that Tommy found himself laughing despite his bruised pride. "Kid, I don't know where you learned to fight like that, but you just gave me a boxing lesson I'll never forget," Tommy said, accepting the handshake with both hands. "What you did in there, I've never seen anything like it." Murphy climbed through the ropes and approached both fighters, his weathered face showing a mixture of amazement and professional curiosity. In his 40 years around boxing, he had witnessed every type of fighter and fighting style, but Marcus represented something entirely new in his experience. "Son, I need to ask you something," Murphy said, placing a hand on Marcus's shoulder. "You got any interest in training here regular? Because what I just saw, that wasn't luck and it wasn't accident. That was pure boxing intelligence, and I'd be honored to help you develop it further." The crowd gathered around the ring, their earlier skepticism replaced by genuine admiration and curiosity. Men who had come expecting entertainment had instead witnessed a demonstration of how dedication, study, and intellectual preparation could overcome seemingly insurmountable physical disadvantages. Marcus adjusted his glasses and looked around at the faces surrounding him. Dock workers, factory employees, and aspiring fighters who had all been transformed from mockers to supporters over the course of a single sparring session. The respect in their expressions was something he had never experienced before, having spent most of his 17 years being dismissed as the bookish son of a shopkeeper. "I would be very interested in training here, Mr. Murphy," Marcus replied, "but I should mention that my approach to boxing is quite different from traditional methods. I believe that scientific principles and theoretical study can enhance natural ability in ways that have not been fully explored." Tommy, still catching his breath from their encounter, nodded enthusiastically. "Whatever you've been studying, it works. I'd like to learn some of those defensive techniques you used. I've never seen anything like that footwork." The gymnasium had fallen completely silent during this exchange, as every person present understood they were witnessing something historic. The nerdy kid with glasses had not just survived an encounter with one of Brooklyn's rising boxing stars. He had dominated it through preparation, intelligence, and the application of scientific principles to athletic competition. Murphy looked around at his gym, recognizing that this night would be remembered and discussed for years to come. "Well then, Marcus, that is your name, right? I think we've got ourselves a new training arrangement. And Tommy, looks like you just found yourself a study partner." As the crowd began to disperse, excited conversations erupted in multiple languages. The story of what had happened at Murphy's gym would spread throughout the neighborhood within hours, growing with each telling but never needing exaggeration because the truth was remarkable enough. Marcus carefully folded his glasses and placed them in his shirt pocket, looking around the gym that had suddenly become a place of possibility rather than intimidation. His theoretical knowledge had been validated, but more importantly, he had discovered a community that valued dedication and intelligence as much as physical strength. The ring stood empty now, but the echo of what had occurred there would inspire countless future fighters to understand that boxing was not just about power and aggression. It was about preparation, intelligence, and the courage to apply knowledge under pressure. Tommy and Marcus walked out of the gym together, their unlikely friendship born from mutual respect and the shared understanding that the best victories come not from defeating others, but from surpassing your own limitations through dedication and study. The whole ring had indeed been silenced, not by knockout or submission, but by the quiet demonstration that intelligence, preparation, and respect could triumph over prejudice and presumption in ways that would be remembered long after the final bell.